you go. All right, so we've all got papers due on Sunday coming up. I've already looked at a couple drafts for people. If anyone's would like me to look over something, happy to do so. Let me know. We could also meet to discuss anything. I got my office hours at the normal times. I can also make appointments if people need. It will obviously have to be a Zoom appointment, but we could go over anything anyone would like to go over. In terms of the daily assignments, I hope that the system is working right. So it took me a while to get it ready. I forgot to actually set up the place for you to turn in the assignment for a little bit. I'll try to get that set up as soon as possible, but hopefully that's working okay. I'm behind on everything, just so you all know. So it might be surprising, but it takes a lot longer to do the online stuff than it does to do the same thing face to face, unfortunately. So I'm a little bit behind with everything. I'm working to get caught up as best I can with rating and whatnot. I'll also probably, if you send me a draft, I probably won't be able to leave you as many comments as I would have liked to. And my comments on the actual paper you turn in is probably going to be less than I would like to, unfortunately, just because I'm behind with everything. But we'll try at least to get as caught up with things as I can get them. So yeah, I think that's all I have in terms of business issues. Any business questions before we get started for today? And remember, if you want to get my attention, you can either send me a question through the chat, or you can give yourself a little thumbs up or something with the reactions tab. And that's how I'll call on you. All right. So let's get started then. So we're on day 2 of Nietzsche. We'll do my plan is 3 days, so we should finish with Nietzsche at the end of this week. That's the goal. Then we can start looking at some other things from there. The first. Yeah, let's just actually get started. I think I'll do that. I'll say that later. So let's just actually get started. Let's just start with some review first and use that as a springboard into what we're going to talk about today. So from last class, we discussed predominantly Nietzsche's account of there being sort of 2 different systems of evaluation. Right? The aristocratic system of evaluation, the noble system, or the master morality, he called it in various places. What is it to be good? Well, it's to be strong, to be healthy, to be powerful, to be beautiful, etc. Right? This is a pretty natural orientation, he thinks, in a certain sense, even though to all of us it's incredibly foreign and alien. But that it's actually quite natural, right? You sort of just ask yourself in a very unproblematic sense, who's leading the better life, me or the person who I'm clubbing with my giant stick? The answer is relatively straightforward. Me, the one doing the clubbing, is better than the one who's getting clubbed. Right? And so the bad, by this sort of noble evaluation, right? The bad are defined sort of just negatively as they're not us. And they're also kind of unfortunate, right? They're the unlucky ones, right? They're the ones that aren't strong, aren't healthy, aren't powerful, aren't beautiful. They're the ones who have the rough of it in life. They're the ones that we enslave, right? And why do we say it's sort of unfortunate or sad for those who are bad? Well, it's because now we nobles are going to go forth and rape, pillage, and plunder them, right? Because they can't stop us from doing so, and that's what we do as nobles, right? That's what we do as people who are strong, healthy, powerful. We go forth, we do great deeds. It's fundamentally a warrior ethos, where what's my sort of mark of valor or mark of goodness is doing great, noble things, and so much the worse for those who I do great, noble things upon. Right? I don't hate the bad on this system evaluation. I don't really think about the bad at all. The bad are sort of the incidental people I step over in the course of doing great noble deeds that get songs written about me. The people I'm actually concerned with are fundamentally other good people, right? Those are my enemies, people who I can fight, and that's awesome because one of 2 things is going to happen when we fight. Either I'll win, and that's awesome, or they'll kill me in glorious combat, and that's pretty good too, right? That's where my concern is. My concern just isn't really with the bad. I don't especially think about them besides when I, incidentally think, oh, wow, it sucked to be that person who I just killed, right? Or sucks to be that city that I just enslaved. This is sharply contrasted, this aristocratic system evaluation, with the slave evaluation we call slave morality, Jewish morality, Christian morality, Buddhist morality. I mean, again, we got to remember Nietzsche's growing enormous rush here. He's sort of with the list of things that he's combining together. The difference between the slave valuation and the aristocratic valuation is fundamentally that The aristocratic valuation starts with defining goodness as myself. The slave valuation does the opposite. It starts by defining evil as all those people who are raping, pillaging, and plundering us, right? So who is evil on the slave valuation? The people who are good on the aristocratic valuation, right? It's an inversion of values. It's not just saying it sucks to be raped, pillaged, and plundered. It's saying the people who rape, pillage, and plunder are evil. And again, remember, bad in the first case, bad really didn't have a moral sense in the aristocratic sense, right? Bad just meant kind of like, yeah, sucks to be you, right? Here it has the sense of wickedness, vileness, wrongness about it. And it's defined first negatively, right? It's those people over there, those are the evil people, the ones who rape, pillage, and plunder me. All right. So then who must be the good? The good must be us, right? The ones who are getting raped, pillaged, and plundered. We must be the good. Who are we? What are our characteristics? Our characteristics are opposite of the aristocratic. Our characteristics are we're weak, we're sick, we're vulnerable, we're unhappy, we're ugly, we're slaves, right? But the twist, we're the ones who are truly blessed by God. Right? And Nietzsche just is like flabbergasted by this, right? We can add some more question marks and exclamation marks into it. So how flabbergasted Nietzsche and how insane Nietzsche thinks that move is, right? We, the blessed, are the ones who get kicked on by life, right? Very different. I mean, it's not like the aristocrats didn't talk about God, right? There were Greek gods, Roman gods, right? But those gods tended to be just like the aristocrats themselves. They tend to like people who are healthy, powerful, and strong. And they tended to help people who are healthy, powerful, and strong. They precisely weren't helping the sort of unfortunate bad people. And the proof of this is that the unfortunate bad people are unfortunate and bad. Right? There's a kind of naturalness to that move. If my life is going really well, it's natural to say, yep, that's because I'm blessed by God. That's why my life is going really well. There's something bizarre about saying my life is going really horribly. That's the proof that God loves me. Right? And that's why he sort of preeminently identifies this as Jewish morality, and then through that Christian morality, because the special status of the Jews is the chosen people, but the chosen people who always have horrible things happen to them as a result of their being chosen and as a result of them sort of falling short of God's commandments. Right? So the key thing that we ended last time with was that this last move is only possible if reality isn't what it actually seems to be. Because what's the sort of just most straightforward, obvious, quote unquote, interpretation of the world? It sucks to be sick. It sucks to be vulnerable. It sucks to be unhappy. It sucks to be ugly. All of these things suck, right? They're bad, and that's not what it means to be blessed. If I'm turning everything on its head, if I'm actually going to say, no, actually what's awful is to be strong. The worst thing for you is to be healthy or to be powerful. And happiness, that's just a one-way road to hell. If I'm going to say all of those things, if I'm going to say all of those things that seem to be just obviously good, if those are now the evil things and the good things are the things that seem to obviously be bad, reality can't be what it actually seems to be, right? I have to go beyond the mere appearance of things to find some true reality behind the appearance or above the appearance or beyond the appearance. And this is what we've been calling transcendence, right? This distinction between what really is versus what only seems to be, right? So what seems to be, that's the ordinary mundane world. What really is, that's the transcendent world. That's God, that's being, that's nirvana, that's Brahman, that's, again, fill in the blank with whatever you'd like. That's Plato's one, right? This transcendent world, this world that's sort of not the world that we normally see, that's where the transcendence lies. And so this is sort of our first hint into what we mean by transcendence when we sort of define religion in terms of it. All right. So all that was just the big review of what we talked about on Tuesday. So let's stop before we go any further. Anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts about anything from last time before we start in anything new? All right, everyone good? All right. Then let's start with the new thing today, where we're going to try to make this idea of transcendence even clearer today. And to do so, we're going to focus on what Nietzsche calls this ascetic priest, the ascetic ideal. So we looked at this term last time. Let's define it just once more. Someone who's ascetic or asceticism is the claim that I have to renounce pleasure in the world to, in some sense, be happy. And it's to be happy in some higher and its transcendent sense. Right? In Taylor, when we were in the first sort of part of the semester, this sense of these were what Taylor was calling the sort of the higher vocations, the higher speeds of religious life, right? People who would take vows of celibacy or vows of poverty, or people who, in the case of people Nietzsche's thinking of, people who would become vegetarians, right? So the Hindu ascetics, they embraced vegetarianism, right? Or they engaged in very difficult, perhaps painful yogic practices, or monastic life, right? All of those would be examples of ascetics, right? People who are giving up the normal sense of happiness. Right. So it's always been the case that that the number of people who are these sort of people living up to this ascetic ideal are quite small, right? But it's also the case, Nietzsche thinks, that you find this kind of asceticism everywhere throughout the world, right? It's not restricted just to Christian circles. It's Western Europe. It's also in India. You see versions of it in Africa. You see versions of it in Asia, right? It's all over the place, he thinks. You find people who sort of embrace this ascetic ideal. And what he's trying to do in the third essay is figure out why. What's going on here with this idea of the ascetic priest? And we talked about last time, right? The ascetic priests themselves are kind of an in-between between the master morality and the slave morality. The master morality tended to have been, Nietzsche thought, held by the aristocrats, by the people in charge of society. Priests themselves in all of these older cultures were indeed a very important social class. They had a very high social standing, right? But it's not a warrior standing. Right. So they're sort of neither. They're neither warriors nor the sort of common everyday person who's getting run over by the warriors. And as a result, Nietzsche actually, I mean, for as much as he dislikes them, and he does indeed dislike these ascetic priests, he actually thinks they're quite fascinating, quite interesting in their own right. They're people who really are committing themselves to a kind of ideal in a way that he finds really interesting and really powerful, though also harmful and dangerous, right? Because the ascetic priests really have to actually be committed. Right? This isn't something you just sort of idly find yourself doing. I mean, maybe you try it for a few days or whatever, but you really have to be committed to this, right? If you're going to give up all meat, I mean, again, we live in a time when there's vegetarianism that's not associated with this, but like, if you were going to give up all meat in India, that's a pretty serious commitment, and like that's going to like have pretty dramatic implications on your diet. If you give up having sex, you're not just giving up having sex a lot of the time, you're giving up sex full more. You gotta nope, doesn't matter. You can't have sex, right? If you take up a monastic vow, you can't really like give those up. I mean, you can, but you're not supposed to at the very least, right? Like this is a life of high commitment. You've got to renounce all of these things and be really committed to the renunciation. It's not easy. And Nietzsche always has a great deal of respect for something that's not Nietzsche. It's not easy. If there's something that's not easy, Nietzsche's going to at least respect it to some extent. So this is going to be our target today. But we need to figure out, these ascetic priests too only make sense in terms of transcendence. So where is the transcendence that they're looking for coming from? That's the question of the day. Where is this desire emerging from, and how is it so widespread? Because, again, the other thing we need to note about these ascetic priests, right? Not only do you need to be committed to be one, they demand commitment of others. Right? It's not just, I'm going to do my thing over here, you all can go lead whatever kind of lives you want. Right? The ascetic priest is precisely one who demands of others that they live up to their own standards to some extent, right? And other people go along with the commitment. Again, that's another reason why Nietzsche finds them so interesting. Right? Priests hold enormous power within their communities, right? At least if we're in a time when this sort of slave morality is operative, the priest always is going to have an enormous role, enormous amount of power, frequently even over the warrior class. That's the oddity here, right? The Pope can actually tell an army that could easily just destroy Rome. The Pope can say, no, stop doing that or I'll excommunicate you, and the warriors will listen, right? Not because the Pope is stronger, but because the Pope is able to sort of get others to go along with them, even other warriors. How then, or why then, are the priests so committed to this transcendence, and how are they able to get others to go along with it? That's sort of the central topic that we're going to address today. So again, let's pause for a second. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts at this point? What did you all think of it? Let's actually take a pause before we even go further into the Nietzsche. What do you all think when you're reading Nietzsche? My guess is probably this is the first time many of you at least have read it. And this is bizarre. So like, what are your thoughts just about him himself? Because he's such a personality and a figure. Go ahead, William.
I like the fact that he's not afraid to be mean to dead people.
Oh,
he's just shitting on basically all of Christianity and everything before Christianity and basically most of human history. I mean, he treats it with this total derision, which is kind of fun to read.
That's
It's just a little sad though, because like, as I understand it, he was also a very sick person, and he hates sick people, obviously, or hates sickliness, but he was racked by physical and mental illnesses that basically turned him into an invalid, which is just kind of cruel irony, I guess.
Yeah, one of certainly the great paradoxes of Nietzsche's life is that he himself was quite sickly. Yes, and that is indeed an odd one that he plays with actually sometimes. I guess in his defense, yeah, it is odd. I mean, I've already said I'm not a huge Nietzsche fan, even though I absolutely respect his genius in a lot of respects, but. If we're engaged in all these vicious ad hominem attacks, I sort of want to respond to him. Why should I listen to a sickly invalid's opinion about health? That's sort of the rejoinder I want to give to him. But yeah, I mean, it's really fun though, right? Just the extent to which he's always on the attack and attacking everything. And indeed fully admits he doesn't have an alternative to any of this, right? But the way he puts it in one place, he philosophizes with a hammer. He's just breaking stuff and trying to break everything and see what happens once it gets broken. So yeah, I think all of that, everything you said seems absolutely right to me. Good. Go ahead.
So I like Nietzsche, but what I wonder and hope maybe you could answer is, did he steal from Zhuangzi? Because I've read Zhuangzi before, and over the summer I got a French translation translated into English that would have been available to Nietzsche.
Right.
And there's lines in Beyond Good and Evil that look word for word identical to Zhuangzi.
He's certainly heavily influenced in a way that was very unusual by Asian philosophies. So he knows it at the very least. I don't actually especially remember him talking especially about that text. He usually talks more about Hinduism and Buddhism.
And I've not heard him talk about it, so I almost kind of think he ripped him off a little bit.
It wouldn't be surprising to me. Yeah, go ahead, continue. Sorry.
It's not in this text. Like this text, there are still similarities to Zhuangzi's
Mhm.
focus on meta ethics as opposed
Right.
to ethics, and his general skepticism of traditional morality.
Yeah.
But like Beyond Good and Evil, and I'll try to find the line sometime this week. But there's a line that's word for word, like almost
How that
like
translation?
Zhuangzi says.
It would not. I don't know anything in particular about his engagement with that text, but I would not be at all surprised. He was very well read, at least by the standards of his time. Anyway, I should say, by the standards of his time, at least, he was very well read in Asian philosophies, and largely doesn't like them either. They largely tend to just get grouped together with the rest of Christianity and everything else he hates. But Taoism, at the very least, isn't as common a target of attack, at least, so that might indicate that he has some affection or affinity toward it, at the very least. Similarly, Confucianism, he doesn't attack that as much either, I think, for similar reasons. I think the way he reads Confucianism, at least, fits within the master morality a little too neatly. It's this noble creed too much to be as much as the sort of he just despises all forms of asceticism, and so he's really opposed to a lot of the stuff that's coming out of India, especially because the Taoists are especially ascetics, even though it's similar to Buddhism in some respects. They're not really ascetics in the same way.
No.
So I hope that was helpful. At least, I mean, that's
that's cool. I'm fascinated by that, whether he did or not, and
I would not. The best I can say at this point, I would not be at all surprised. It seems like the sort of thing. It also seems like the way in which the Tao is characterized is the sort of thing that would more interest him than, say, the way Nibbana is characterized in Buddhism too. So yeah, it seems quite possible to me, at least, that there's a real overlap there.
Okay.
Good. Any others? Any other initial thoughts about this text? I mean, this text is so weird. Right, and he's like quite racist. Right? I mean, he's unabashedly racist, but it's almost hard to identify because he's racist against everyone, right? Like he gets used by the Nazis, but it's laughable the extent to which he like vehemently attacks the Germans again and again and again in these texts. Right, frequently saying that he far prefers the Jews to the Germans and the German smallness and the German pedanticism. I mean. He seems to just hate everything and everyone and to be attacking everything and everyone. And it's quite hard to know what to do with a lot of it. And a lot of it gets misused very clearly to support things that Nietzsche himself never would have supported. Right. One of the great ironies is what Nietzsche basically has a nervous breakdown at the end of his life. And once that happens, his sister, who's basically a proto-Nazi, she's like the predecessor party to what would become the Nazi Party in Germany, she takes all of his writings and edits a bunch of them to make them seem way more explicitly anti-Semitic for her own purposes. The translation we're reading is the original. It is not the edited one. But, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, go ahead, Rowan.
Yeah, kind of, I mean, similar on a kind of similar note. But, like, I haven't read any Nietzsche before, but I have read some, like, Ayn Rand,
Yes.
And I think Ayn Rand, like, definitely, I think she's a lot less articulate and a lot less, like, nuanced than Nietzsche. But there's some, like, really similar, it kind of feels pretty similar reading them.
Yes, and not accidentally so. She would admit as much. She would admit her teacher was a Nietzschean scholar.
Oh, really?
So very directly, I mean, now I would sort of describe her as a really bad version of Nietzsche. Nietzsche would hate Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
Nietzsche would not be an objectivist because all of amongst the many things Nietzsche hates, capitalism is right up there at the top of things that, again, something that's small, petty, British, right? And so he would be opposed to objectivism in that regard. But there are Rand definitely takes some of the sort of like noble creator elements out of Nietzsche and repurposes them to be compatible with capitalism, or tries to repurpose them to be compatible with capitalism at least. So yeah, I think that's definitely right.
Yeah, I'm not like much of a fan of Ayn Rand either. Like, reading Nietzsche, it seems like a lot more complex, but there are just like certain things that are similar. So
Yeah, there definitely are. That's 100% right. Good. I saw another hand up. Up, go ahead.
I kind of just feel like he gets at a lot of like frustrations that people have with like certain religions and ideals. Like a lot of people, like there's a lot of questions that people have, and they kind of just like from a glance like ask them, and like, you know, but he kind of gets right at them and is like, no, this is a serious problem with what's happening here. And I think that's kind of interesting, just how he attacks it head on.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a big part of Nietzsche's appeal, and it was certainly his appeal to me when I was first reading him, was the way in which another thing he's sort of at the foundation of, is at the foundation of existentialism. He also heavily influences all the existentialists, and he's sort of usually considered the first or one of the first existentialists. The way in which he's constantly sort of calling really abstract questions back to sort of like lived life. Right. And so getting at the kinds of concerns people sort of more have in an everyday, almost a kind of everyday sense, or sort of quasi everyday sense. I think that's right. I think that's definitely right. I think it's a big part of his appeal. He's not just asking these as abstract thought puzzles. These are what's at stake is your entire ways of life for him, the entire history of the West. It's more almost hitting at some of the spirit at which people first come to philosophy, right? We sort of come to philosophy in the same, like, I'm going to break everything and figure out what's really true spirit that he himself is working from, I think. Yeah, that seems right. That also seems quite right to me. Good. Good. Any other thoughts? I think those are the hands I saw. Any others? All right. Oh, good. Go ahead. Try again. There you go.
Yeah. So it was interesting to me when he kind of conflates society and the things that society holds on to, that they're fossilized parts of religion, and that also means the evils, the bad things of religions are held onto by the religions, and thus stay throughout the history of society.
Very much so. That's exactly right. I mean, the way I first introduced Nietzsche to you all was when we were going through these sort of alternatives to both the sort of like the sort of like secular humanism on the one hand and religious fundamentalism on the other. Nietzsche was one of those sort of like trying to come up with alternatives. And the reason he's obvious, it's pretty obvious why he doesn't like religion, but as we'll go through today, the reason he doesn't like secular humanism is he thinks it's still just religion by a different name, right? Yeah. It preserves all of it. It preserves the sickness, if you want to use that language, right? It preserves the sickness, but hides it and does a better job of hiding it. And so there are people who are far sicker today than they were if they were simply flagellating themselves, like they were at some point during the Middle Ages. They were actually probably far healthier with their self-flagellation than the weird kinds of self-flagellation we've come up with, right? I mean, think truly how weird society has to be for anorexia to emerge, right? For people to purposefully, deliberately be starving themselves, right? That's way more self-cruelty than I'm just gonna like whip myself to like, because I'm mad at my sins, right? But yet all of that sort of self-hatred is preserved in our society and becomes neurotic in all of these far more vicious forms than it did when it could just outright be expressed by like, yeah, I'm gonna like hammer a nail through my hand in so that I can experience the crucifixion like Christ did, or whatever, right? I mean, it's sort of more violent in one sense, but on the other hand, it's also like easier to deal with than the sort of inner psychic torments we come up with for ourselves. Yeah, that seems absolutely right to me, what you're saying about the way you sort of diagnosing that. In a different reading in the Gay Sciences, he says the sort of like, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but the atheists are the ones who have least of all realized the full ramifications of having killed God. Because the atheists are still holding on to all of the system, all of the morality, the guilt, the this, that, and all the other thing, right? They're still holding on to all of it, and so they're going to be just as neurotic, if not even more so, than those actually in the sway of Christian morality explicitly, right? Doing it sort of as such. Yeah, that's I completely agree. Good. Any others? All right. Let's start. Well, and obviously, the whole reason we're doing the Zoom is so that we can actually do the back and forth stuff. That's the actual fun stuff. So let's continue keep raising stuff. We'll start working through the ascetic priest, and don't hesitate to let me know if we want questions or comments as we sort of advance. All right. So we've got our ascetic priests. What are they about? What is it that what is actually their ideal? Let's just even start there. What is it? All right. First, there's another world besides this one. And for the sake of today, let's call this just the true world. I'm going to capitalize true because this word's going to be an important one. Right? So there's a true world, all right? And then there's our world. Our world here. All right? Let's call that sort of an apparent world. Or maybe a false world, right? If we're emphasizing this idea of truth. All right? And almost more importantly than the world, there's another life besides this life. A true life there, that this true life is lived in this other world, this true world. Right? So firstly, it's dualistic, right? I'm dividing sort of reality in half in some sense, right? There's really what's real. That's the transcendent world, right? And then there's the sort of world I see around me, the false world, the apparent world, the one that's not the true one. All right. What's good is the true world? Oh, sorry, what is the apparent world? And it's worth sort of just emphasizing this point, right? This apparent world, this fake life, that's the life. What am I talking about? I'm talking about me getting up in the morning, getting up, making some lunch, petting my dog, letting her outside, right? Doing some class prep, grading some papers, worrying about money, trying to compete with my colleagues for grants. That's the world we're saying is the false world or the apparent world, right? The normal world, the world that hitherto we would have just identified as the world. That's the false one, right? What good is this false world? It's only valuable as far as we use it to get to the true one. So it only has, at best, instrumental value, right? And if I spend all my time petting my dog, eating breakfast, studying for class, and yada, 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 right? I'm wasting it. I'm not using it properly. I should only be using this world to sort of help me get at the real one, to get at the real life, the life I should live. Okay, now, let's pause for a second, leave the screen for a second. Okay, what does that actually concretely mean? Well, it can mean all kinds of different things, right? It could mean heaven, right? That could count, that could fit the bill, right? Nirvana in the Buddhist context, it could mean something like that. That could fit the bill. But it could also mean something not so much, I don't have to die first to get, right? It could be a mystical union with God, right? That's something that can actually be attained while I'm living this life, but only if I use this life here in a very special way, right? Like, how do you attain mystical union with God? It's not by petting my dog, eating breakfast, studying for class. It's by intense yogic meditation practice. It's by extreme ascetic practices of denying myself food, right? How did the Buddha become enlightened? The Buddha became enlightened by fasting for 40 days, right? And indeed, that's actually not entirely fair. Nietzsche's cheating a little bit, because actually that wasn't how the Buddha became enlightened. The Buddha became enlightened after a child came up to him after day 40 and said, "Dude, you look like you're starving. Would you like a little sip of milk?" And it's actually when he has the sip of milk, that's actually when he attains enlightenment, technically. But at the very least, he needed the 40 days of starvation under the tree first, at least, right? Buddhism actually sells itself as a middle ground between the extreme asceticism of Hindu practice and the just sort of eating breakfast, right? The sort of normal practice. It sort of sees itself as a middle. To Nietzsche, that's still quite ascetic. Right? You have to engage in these extreme ascetic practices to use the world properly. And this is what Taylor was calling this higher or faster speed of religious life. Right? That's how you do it. That's how you can use this world. So you use this world by basically rejecting it. And using it as a ladder to attain something else. That's the use that it has, right? And of course, the ascetic priest doesn't just do this himself, right? He demands of others that they do it too. Right? The ones who don't, they are precisely the sinners, the wicked, right? Those are probably those warriors who are running around enslaving people, right? That's certainly not an ascetic life. That's not a life of denying yourself things, right? So they too, right, should be doing what we're doing, right? And this wasn't always true, and particularly if you go like really far back, there was basically just a priestly class that itself did the ascetic thing, but it sort of did the ascetic thing for the whole community. So like Greek priests, they weren't proselytizing anything, right? Greek priests would do they would be ascetics. They would, especially sex, they would deny themselves various things, right? But they're sort of doing it on behalf of everyone else. They've got the asceticism job taken care of so everyone else can do others. The kind of priest that Nietzsche's talking about, he's thinking about Christianity here foremost on his mind, right? They demand of others that they follow along with it too. So it's not just some people doing this for the whole community. It's something that the demand is put to everyone. And indeed, frequently people go along with them. If not all the way, right? You know, again, it's always a relatively small percentage of people that actually becomes an ascetic in this regard. Not very many people actually became monks, but there are the lower, what Taylor was calling these lower speeds. Right? You have people at least getting on that to that extent, right? At least like, okay, I'm not going to give up sex, but at least I'll only have sex when I'm married. Or at the very least, I'll feel bad when I have sex and I'm not married afterwards. Right, like something, like people who are at least like taking some small version of the ascetic ideal and incorporating it into their own life. Again, for the sake of this higher life, this true life. All right, so let's pause for a second. How are we doing so far? How are you with this distinction between this true versus this apparent life? Because that's going to be the key distinction today that we're going to be trying to make sense out of. Any questions about that at this point? Go ahead. We'll start with Kendall. Go ahead.
I'm just kind of like the way that they're saying like true versus apparent.
Right.
Kind of makes me like, do they not think this world is like reality? Like that's kind of confusing me in that way.
A little bit, like it depends on the specific version of this that we're looking at, right? And again, Nietzsche's drawing such a huge brushstroke, right? He's throwing so many different things together into one account. But at the very least, like if the big three that he's using as exemplars here, Buddhism does indeed say that there's something unreal about your normal life. Now, again, how is that characterized? A lot of different ways, right? I mean, but there's a kind of unreality up to it. It's not real, at least in the way you think it's real. Hinduism, way more so, just straightforwardly says the true reality is Brahman, and all of this is Brahman's dream. right? So this, maybe it's not nothing, but it has a dream kind of reality rather than like a real kind of reality to it. And Christianity, at least some mystical versions of Christianity, which we'll talk more about later, will indeed say that the only true thing that really exists is God. And everything else is just an image or an echo of God. God is the real thing that exists. And so all this world is a sort of echo of God that I need to push through to get to the true reality of God. And by the way, including myself, right? All I truly am is an echo of God too, or an echo of Christ, right? And what's needed is a kind of divinification, right? Becoming a son of Christ as well. And so at least in those three, the most extreme versions of all three of those traditions at least, yeah, the claim kind of is that like this world isn't really real in some fundamental sense, right? We'll have a lot more to say about how do we characterize that, but in some fundamental sense, yeah, this isn't as, at least it's not as real as the real world. The true world, the transcendent world. The transcendent is more real than the physical. Good. All right. William, I saw you too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much of this apparent world versus true world dichotomy was present in the aristocratic morality. Like if they had any sort of semblance of some sort of transcendence or anything like that.
So to Nietzsche, that particular move is not present in the aristocratic sense evaluation at all. It's why like Plato and Aristotle, even though they're not Christians, they're not nobles anymore either. They're something else. That because the aristocratic sense is too committed to like, no, this world's the real world, right? This world where I'm like getting drunk all the time and having lots of sex and getting into fights and doing all of these noble deeds. Like that's the real stuff, right? Maybe there are gods and I don't know exactly what they are. I think of them just as sort of like bigger and better versions of myself maybe. And maybe in some sense they're transcendent or I can't see them or something. But this is the real world, right? The world where I'm going forth and doing all this great fun stuff. And indeed, the way that, at least like in the Iliad, the gods get talked about, they get talked about as if they're kind of immanent in this world. They're sort of like things that are floating around that, at least in principle, I could maybe run into Zeus one day. Right? Whereas I'm never going to run into the Christian God. Again, unless I met Christ, and even there, that's ambiguous. Now that Christ is dead, I'm never going to actually encounter the Christian God on the street. I'm never going to encounter Brahman on the street. Maybe I'll encounter an avatar of Brahman again, but that's not encountering Brahman. I'm never going to encounter Nibbana when I'm at Circle K getting my gas changed or whatever, right? Like I'm never going to find those things in the world. The aristocratic value, it's all stuff that in principle is this world here. Because I love this world here, it's great. I get everything I want I can go get in this world. So is that helpful?
Yeah, very.
Okay, good. Go ahead, Weston.
Can you just speak on how Nietzsche correlates to Taylor's higher and lower?
So Nietzsche, that's a great question, well worth clarifying. So what Nietzsche's saying here is that the lower speed, that sort of corresponds with what the people in the slave morality itself are doing. So they're sort of like doing the slower speed version of religious life. The ascetic priests are doing the higher speed version. They're the ones who sort of are fully committed to the ideal. The lower speed, the average person, the slave or whatever, they've internalized a lot of the parts of the ascetic ideal, but they're not living it in the same kind of committed way. So they just sort of like feel guilty about stuff. For example, they aren't refraining from themselves or denying themselves the capacity to do certain things. They do them, but then sort of feel guilty about it. Or maybe they refrain doing some things, like maybe I won't cheat on my wife, but I still am like having a lot of sex. I'm not like a celibate monk. So they sort of internalize some of the principles of asceticism, but they're not leading the sort of fully committed ascetic life. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, excellent. Good.
Oh wait, where does master morality work?
So the master morality is kind of outside of the whole system as far as Nietzsche thinks.
Oh, okay.
The master morality is what sort of gets killed by both the priestly class and then the slave morality. They sort of kill off the master morality by getting the masters to go along with the notion that it's wrong to rape, pillage, and plunder people. Basically.
Okay.
That basically what's the death of the Roman world when Christianity is able to persuade the people who are killing them it's bad to kill us. Right? And so then even though the slaves and the priests are weaker than the warriors, they now rule over the warriors because they tell the warriors what's good and what's bad. And in the context of Taylor, we saw this is sort of like this ever escalating cycle throughout the history of the West. By the time you get to all these sort of civilizing efforts, right, it's an even more extreme version. Like we're gonna like force the warriors to do what not warriors say, and not by killing them, but by getting they themselves to want to do what we say they should do. That's sort of the trick. The trick is getting people who are strong to accept that it's bad to be strong. And that was the slave revolt. That was what Nietzsche was calling the slave revolt in morality. That somehow all the values turned, even on the people who actually had no reason to change them. Even their values changed too. So is that helpful? Does that clear up that those relations?
Yeah, totally.
Excellent. Good. Good. Any others? All right, let's go back to it then. All right. So we've got this ascetic ideal. We've got this idea of this sort of true world. Okay, why does this actually exist at all? Nietzsche, for the purpose of this particular work, Nietzsche is not even going to bother arguing that there is no actually transcendent world. He's just assuming that there's no transcendent world. He's just taking that as sort of obvious in a certain sense. And as we'll talk about next class period, this is what he means when he says God is dead. What it means to say that God is dead is that no one really believes there's a transcendent world anymore. That's all it ultimately is going to mean. So okay, so he's just assuming this. If that's true, and let's just assume with him today, for the sake of argument, that he's right, that everything the ascetic priest is saying is just wrong, just straightforwardly false, then the ascetic ideal just seems insane. It's a kind of self-hatred and a hatred of life. That's all it could sort of be if there's not a transcendent world, right? Because in a sense, the ascetic priest might even concede that they hate themselves and hate life. They just hate the apparent life, their apparent selves, not the true ones, right? So they might even, in a sense, concede the point, but it's all for the sake of the true world. If there's no true world, this is just pure self-hatred on Nietzsche's view, right? This is pure self-destructive. It's self-contradictory, Nietzsche thinks. A way of life that's about hating life. It's an absurdity. It's nonsense, right? Like, it makes no sense whatsoever. So why does it actually exist? Right? And it exists both in the form of the priest. But how is the priest also able to get other people to go along with it, right? Like, it's one thing just to explain why you might have one self-hating person. Why is that one self-hating person able to make everyone else hate themselves too? That's the bewildering thing. Okay. And this is where we will now get into talks of sickness. There is, Nietzsche argues, a fundamental sickness in the human condition. Right? And we've actually heard talk about this sickness before. Taylor made reference to it, right? There are those moments when you just feel elated, when life is just awesome, everything's going well. There's normal everyday life, and then there's times when you just, like, life just seems like it's shitty, right? Perhaps if many of you are like me, the past couple weeks have seen one of those lower moments, right? Where life seems more empty. Right? Where you're filled with ennui. Or tiredness. Right? Where you're suffering and sick. or in pain of various sorts, right? And that's all you sort of see. Depression, alienation, times when you don't know why you bother to go on. But find yourself going on anyway. Everyone should have some basic experience of this, right? This is what, and Taylor thought literally everyone should have some basic experience of this, right? There are these times, and for some people, these times are more pronounced than others. Apparently, there's actually a limit to how much I can type in one text box, and I just reached it. So we've got the warrior nobles. They're probably not especially bothered by this. But there are others who are seriously bothered by it and who are at risk of giving into a kind of despair, despairing of life. This is the flock of the ascetic priest. The ascetic priest is the shepherd of the sick. And he himself is sick too. Right? He's just the one who's found the cure. Right? The ascetic priest, at least at first, again, prior to the slave revolt, the ascetic priest has nothing to really offer the warrior. The warrior, when the warrior is like, oh, I'm having such a bad day, I know I'll go, like, rape some random woman that I find on the streets, and then I'll feel better. Right? Or in the case of the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'll go wrestle someone to death on the street corner. Just some like random dude. I'll just go wrestle him and I'll kill him because I'm stronger and then I'll feel better. Right? They are not, again, they're very simple people, these warriors, as Nietzsche thinks. They are not driven by any sort of deep existential ennui. That's not part of their lives. The people who are confronting that kind of ennui, those are the people who are interested in what the ascetic priest has to offer. Those are the ones for whom the ascetic priest can offer them something. The ascetic priest can offer the transcendent as a cure for their illness. Right. But what kind of cure is it? That's actually the key question for Nietzsche. Right? Because again, we're just assuming there is no actual transcendence, right? So this transcendence can't actually be the cure for anything. It doesn't exist. There is no transcendent world. What is actually going on with the cure? Well, the cure is alleviating the suffering that you feel. And again, it doesn't make it go away, but it lets you understand it and direct it. So what form does this take? I suffer. Priest's response. True, but that's because you are a sinner. Right? Now there is an explanation for the suffering. There is an explanation for the ennui, for the tiredness, for the alienation you feel. right? For the depression, for the pain of life, there is now an explanation for it. You are the explanation. Your own failure is the explanation. And Nietzsche actually just thinks that kind of will help you feel better in a certain sense. Like, oh, that's why it's happening. Okay, great. I guess I'm going to flagellate myself now, right? But indeed, like, when you flagellate yourself, like, why do people flagellate themselves? I mean, let's actually, like, real talk for a second, right? Like, why is sadomasochism a thing? Because inflicting pain upon yourself can indeed be pleasurable. There is pleasure to be found in the infliction of pain. The nobles enjoy it. The nobles just inflict pain on other people, right? The nobles loved inflicting pain. They just don't inflict it on themselves, right? Those who are weak, the slaves, they can't inflict pain upon the masters. What's their only target? They have to inflict pain upon themselves. The priests offer them a way of doing this, a way of turning their hatred back upon themselves so that you can quite literally get the pleasure of self-hatred. Because hating things is fun. And if you don't believe me that hating things is fun, explain to me why Twitter is the way that Twitter is. People just seem to delight in hating stuff on Twitter. They go out of their way to hate stuff on Twitter, to find things to get angry. And it doesn't make you feel better, right? Like when you actually get in a rage about something you saw on Twitter, you actually just are more agitated and more distressed ultimately, right? But it's fun, it's pleasurable to hate something. It's pleasurable to be angry, and you're willing to almost put up with the fact that you're actually even worse off because you got the kind of pleasure of hatred, right? That's kind of literally what Nietzsche thinks. I mean, not even kind of, that's literally what Nietzsche thinks is happening here. What Nietzsche's literal diagnosis of all of this, what's actually going on, you actually make yourself sicker in this way. But you start taking pleasure in making yourself sicker. And the way you can inflict sort of pain upon yourself, you become anesthetized to it. And once you start down this road, there is no limit to the kinds of self-cruelty human beings are capable of inventing, right? Sure, you can flagellate yourself and all, but there's way cleverer kinds of self-destructive, self-nullifying pain you can subject her to than the physical pains. The physical pains are almost the least of it, right? You can rack yourself with guilt, with the promise of future eternal damnation. Right? You can grow obsessed with eternal damnation and enjoy the pleasure of that. And one thing we didn't talk about in the last meeting, Nietzsche has this extended quotation that was all in Latin, which I'm sorry about. It was a quote from Thomas Aquinas. And it's where St. Thomas Aquinas is explaining that one of the pleasures of heaven is going to be looking at hell and looking at and enjoying the suffering of all those who are eternally damned. That's one of the pleasures reserved for the elect in hell. Of course, he puts it enjoying God's infinite justice, right? But infinite justice, just infinite cruelty, infinite suffering, infinite damnation, making all of these things eternal. The suffering God, the God on the cross, right? The God who is the God of suffering, worshiping the suffering God, right? That can be pleasurable in a sense. I mean, not like pleasant exactly, right? Like it's not like a nice Sunday afternoon or whatever, but like, in the same way that people like hating things on Twitter, you can like that. Like, you can get into that. And that's at root what Nietzsche thinks is happening here. That is at root the cure that the priest has to offer. Hold on one second. And there's various versions that this can take. There's various sort of forms of this. So the most extreme form, there's actually the ascetic priest himself. What is this person seeking? They're seeking a kind of mystical union with the transcendence. Or as we'll talk about, actually, we're gonna start talking about this because this sort of mysticism is the thing. Taylor's not wrong to not talk about it. It basically is driven out of the West during the time frame that Taylor was talking in. But this is the thing that gets this sort of mysticism is very much what gets lost after the Protestant Reformation. The transcendent God is the God who equals nothingness. And indeed, we are going to read like some Dionysius the Areopagite and Meister Eckhart, both of whom are going to explicitly say, yes, God is nothing. They don't mean God doesn't exist. They mean God is non-being, non-existence. We'll talk about it. We'll try to figure out later what any of that possibly means. Right? A kind of a nullification of self. Which Nietzsche identifies as a kind of self-hypnosis. That indeed you actually might experience as intensely ecstatically pleasurable, right? If you read the sort of accounts of the yogis or the Buddhist sages or even the Christian mystics, right? They all talk about these sort of like moments in their meditation practice of extreme, overwhelming pleasure. And each is like, yeah, they sort of hypnotize themselves, right? Most people don't have the self-hypnosis. Most people don't have the commitment to actually go all that way. But, if nothing else, you can just work hard, right? That's a way of forgetting your pains. There are the kinds of sort of public civic rituals. And the priest makes that available to us. And, whatever else you come up with. You can come up with all kinds of things, right? You can come up with fire and brimstone preaching. You can use that. But you can also turn outwards. You can preach against sinners. Right? So you can sort of like, everyone in the church can enjoy not being one of the sinners and hating the sin of the sinners, of course, right? But Nietzsche's just like, that's just shorthand for hating the sinners by another name, just another way of hating people. And hating people is, again, fun, right? Nietzsche's definition for what the church is, by the way, is just a public civic kind of ritualized ecstasy. That's all Nietzsche means by the church. That's all he thinks it is. It's why you can get rid of the church and actually not get rid of the rest of this. You can actually outlaw the church and still preserve all these other forms, right? But you can even go full Protestant. And you can make this a purely private thing. Which Nietzsche probably hates most, thinks is the worst of all of these. Right? Because this last one makes small, petty concerns of life issues for God to deal with. I mean, at least, Nietzsche doesn't think there's any gods, right? But at least, like, the Greek gods, they were, Hercules doesn't, like, whine to God because, like, he got a B on his chemistry exam, right? Like, Hercules is like, I have been cursed by Hera and have done these noble deeds, and a treacherous woman put a poisoned lion skin on me, and I'm dying in agony. Zeus, tell me why. Right? I mean, like, at least that's cool. And that's almost the sense in which you have to constantly think of this with Nietzsche. Like, at least that's like a cool thing for God to be concerned with. That's a concern that would be worthy of God if God did in fact exist. The kind of like, I'm just going to talk to God about how my day went, right? Like, that's making the small pettiness of my day big and important, when indeed it's not big and important, right? I would only do that if there was nothing more important in my life or in my day, that I could turn to or could point to. All right. So let's pause for a second. So here we go. We've done Nietzsche's story about what is sort of the appeal of the ascetic priest, right? How is the ascetic priest sort of able to win converts? And what's going on in religion? How is religion functioning? What is it offering people? It's bad. Nietzsche thinks it's all bad, but it is indeed offering something. It's offering, a kind of maybe not cure, but a kind of almost painkiller that you could take to ignore the pain of life if you're not strong enough to actually outright face it directly. And again, remember, Taylor used exactly that same formulation. That was exactly what Taylor said the atheists were going to say to justify atheism. Atheism is the mature, courageous, harsh way of life that nevertheless looks at life as it really is. Whereas religion is the childish life that can't really face the real world and so turns to these fantasies. Okay. How are we doing with everything we just went through? Any questions, concerns, thoughts about any of this? This is one last thing I want us to do today, but I want to make sure we're good with this last step first. All right, good so far? Are y'all going to give up Twitter? My sincere hope. Hate following things on Twitter. If this class accomplishes nothing else, is to stop hate following people on Twitter. It's not healthy. Go ahead.
I mean, like I see things that I hate on like Twitter or social media, but I feel like I hate it with a reason, and my reason is like I can have a solution.
Even then, so here's what Nietzsche's going to say, at least. Here's what Nietzsche's going to say. Nietzsche's going to say, even then you're wasting your time, right? Why are you worrying about the dumb stuff? Ignore the dumb stuff, right? Ignore the stupid stuff, right? Like, getting worked up by it is just making yourself worse. Associate yourself only with the best people, with the best things. That's the noble way, right? That's the healthy way of life, right? If you associate with sickness, all you'll do is make yourself sick.
So even if it's something like as important as like racial injustice or something, like I would get angry about something something severe like that. He says, don't even pay attention to that stuff.
I mean, yeah, and it's worth noting. I mean, he's a white a white German gentleman, right? So it's a bit easier for him to say that, perhaps. But yes, even more broadly, I imagine that would be what he would say even to the victim of racialized injustice. He would say, those people are like, if you spend all of your time being aware of your own injustice, you're just going to get sort of caught in the muck of it. Even that you must sort of just look behind and laugh at the fools who would dare challenge you. Like, I mean, his thing is always laughter. He's always just like, laugh at stupid things. Don't get angry at them, right? Just be like, look how much better I am than these stupid racists. That would be his right. But even there, you can't do that. You can't even cheat and do that too much, right? Because at a certain point, that would become sort of for him neurotic too, right? Like you should have this sense that I am just far superior to that which is beneath me, and I'm not going to really be troubled that much, except to occasionally laugh at that which is beneath me. My focus is on things that are like me, as great as I am. Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche's not an egalitarian. He's not concerned with democracy. He's not concerned with justice. But I mean, that is at least what he would. I believe that is probably the advice he would give, even to the person who is the victim of racialized injustice. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. Any others? All right, let's do the last part, and then this is the key. We'll return to this full bore. We'll just return to it next class period because we're not going to be able to finish it, but I at least want to introduce this last idea today. The question Nietzsche ends this reading with today: what's the alternative to the ascetic ideal? There was the warrior ethos, but as we talked about last time, that's dead to all of us. We can barely even understand that way of seeing the world, right? It's a distant past that none of us have any access to. The way Nietzsche puts it in today's reading, all of us are far too good to ever imagine we could be the warrior who's running around raping, killing, and pillaging, right? It's just, we can't wrap our minds around that as modern, in his case, Europeans. We just can't wrap our minds around it. Okay, so what is the alternative? Well, here's one thing you might say. You might say atheism is the alternative. Right? Perhaps that's where you will point to your alternative to this, right? So this was, again, this was the sort of the antipode, right? We sort of saw that modernity is sort of defined in a certain sense by the fundamental dyad between, on the one hand, the religious fundamentalism, and on the other hand, the sort of scientific materialist atheism, right? These are sort of the two poles. So, okay, if we say this aesthetic ideal, that sounds more like the evangelical side, why can't we just say it's the other side? Why isn't atheistic scientific materialism the alternative to the problem? But indeed, Nietzsche says it is not. In fact, this is just the fulfillment of it. Despite the fact that explicitly, atheistic materialism denies all transcendence. In fact, Nietzsche says it actually doesn't. Why not? All right? Why not? Why is this atheistic scientific materialism still fundamentally a philosophy rooted in transcendence? Does Nietzsche say? Well, here's why. Because what do scientists care about? What do they care about? Well, the truth. Let's capitalize it. The truth. That's what they care about. Indeed, what is their highest value? Truthfulness. Right? Why should you believe global warming is happening? Because it's true. And like, I'm gonna stop. I need to like hit my table for a second. Hold on. Like it's not just true. It's like it's true. Right? Like where that like means something, right? Like how dare you blaspheme truth? How dare you insult truth by denying what science has determined is true? How dare you? I mean, and indeed, you hear that, right? I mean, maybe you feel that yourself sometimes, right? This sort of sense that just like, almost like, who do you think you are that you can deny the truth? Who do you think you are who can deny the wonder that is truth? Truthfulness, by which you mean the true world, by which you mean the highest name for God. God is truth. In the whole logic of the aesthetic priest. Remember, that was the whole move. The whole move was there's a true world and the apparent or false world. The way in which scientific materialism holds on to truth, clings to it as the highest value, just preserves transcendence in its highest form. The claim that and this is what we'll return to on Thursday. This is a good place to end for today. The very idea of truth itself is a transcendent idea. That is at least the claim that Nietzsche is making here. And so long as you are committed to what's true, you are committed to transcendence. So that should make all of us pause for a second and go, wait, what in the world do we mean by transcendence, actually? If that's right. What does that possibly mean? And what does transcendence possibly mean? Because he's got a compelling case. You know where this comes from? Truth is the highest value? It comes from Plato. Or Socrates. Right? And as far as Nietzsche is concerned, Christianity is just Platonism for the people. That's the other of Nietzsche's famous lines about Christianity. Christianity is Platonism for the people, for the mass, Platonism for the slaves. This is what we need to start turning toward. This sense of transcendence. Because Christianity is fully committed to this sense of transcendence. Probably Hinduism is. I'm actually not sure if Buddhism is. I don't know if Buddhism actually fits into the story Nietzsche's telling at all. But Hinduism is committed to it. Islam is committed to it. Judaism is committed to it. This is the sense of transcendence we're going to need to start working on. All right. So I'm going to let everyone go. We have time, since I'm just sitting in my basement, right? I don't have to go anywhere. We can still ask questions, but if people need to go anywhere, because I know we're at time, if people need to go anywhere, feel free. Otherwise, we can do a few questions and then start up next time with Heidegger's essay on Nietzsche's word, God is dead. Go ahead, Rachel. Go ahead.
Can we just go back to the board for a second?
Absolutely, not a problem.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay.
You good? All right.
Yeah.
Good. Any other last thoughts or questions? I mean, I'll say this, you should have many questions. William, we'll start with you.
So he has this picture of master and slave morality that feels almost like it's kind of situated in some sort of historical context. Like, yes. I feel like, you mentioned he was a Greek scholar. Is he like basing this off of a specific time period in like Greek history or?
More than anything else, I think what he talks about lots of things. He tries to argue this is applicable everywhere. More than anything else, what he seems to have in mind is the transition from the Roman Empire to the Christianized Roman Empire.
Okay,
that seems to be the sort of, even though he's talking about stuff like Hinduism and all of that, like a lot of the stuff he's saying doesn't apply to India really in any meaningful sense at all. But it applies very distinctly to what's his paradigmatic case, which is the transition, the 30-year transition from feeding Christians to lions to having a Christianized Roman Empire.
Yeah, I feel like also with this master morality, I'm curious if that would still be apparent if you go further and further back into history to sort of like a prehistoric hunter-gatherer society, or very, very early aspects of civilization. Because I'm worried that master morality, he makes kind of an assumption about human nature there almost. Because it seems like he's talking about it in absolute, almost like, master morality is this thing that has sort of existed as part and parcel to human nature.
I don't think he actually thinks that he is. I think he thinks it is just one human possibility amongst other human possibilities, not that it's a natural one. Okay. I think what he would say is, even if you go back to sort of the more, the quote unquote primitive hunter-gatherer societies, what were primitive hunter-gatherer societies concerned with? Raiders, pirates, right? The people who would come in and steal all the shit you just spent an entire year growing on your farm and take it from you because you spent that whole year growing stuff and they spent that whole year learning how to kill people with swords. And so you very much are at their mercy. And you could be enslaved by them. This was Sparta, right? So going back a little bit in time, what Sparta basically did, Sparta enslaved the indigenous farmer population. They were called the Helots. The reason why Sparta was able to have such a militarily advanced society where all of the citizens were sort of professional soldiers was because the Sparta's main concern was using that army to keep their enslaved farmers working and growing food for them. That's why Sparta didn't conquer the rest of Greece. They didn't conquer the rest of Greece because if the army left, their slaves would rise up and revolt. Right? And by who do I mean by their slaves? I mean the people who grow their food and like do all the not killing people parts of everyday life. Right? So even in a hunter-gatherer society, there's at least the threat of the warrior class, the threat of the pirate, the raider. And if you read the ancient Greek myths, the Greek heroes literally just sound like pirates. Like, they sail to a place, land, steal a bunch of stuff, and then, like, usually burn the city down and then go home again. And that's their heroism. That's their great heroic deeds. So I think he thinks this was... it might not be natural, but he thinks this one is kind of like something that's very likely to emerge if you've got non-civilized people. If you have civilized people, you're not going to have warriors running around raping, pillaging, and plundering everything. If you don't have civilized people, though, you're going to have people who are strong enough to go forth and just do whatever they feel like doing. And what they're going to feel like doing is raping, pillaging, and plundering. So does that, I don't know if that fully answers, does that at least help with thinking about it?
Yeah.
All right, good. Any others? Yeah, go ahead.
When we're speaking about like the truth being like the highest value and stuff,
right.
When to me when I hear the saying like truth, it's like to find something out, to discover something. Is that what we're trying to get at here?
A little bit, but notice even there, right? If the truth is something you have to find out, it's not what obviously is around you. If you have to search for the truth, if you have to find the truth isn't the apparent world, it's what's behind the apparent world. It's what's behind it. Well, you have to seek out the truth that's behind all of the sort of nonsense and noise that cover the truth over in the course of everyday life. That's the sense in which it's something transcendent. That it's presupposing that there is this reality that I have to find behind the reality that I normally see, even if I would never normally characterize it. That's kind of the logic of saying I have to find the truth.
Yeah.
And that's why Nietzsche thinks that's still fundamentally transcendent as far as Nietzsche's concerned. And it's because of all this Platonism stuff that we'll start talking about next class. But that's fundamentally rooted in something transcendent, he thinks.
Okay.
Good. Yeah, go ahead.
So does Nietzsche talk at all about like what we kind of talked about earlier with like the celestial versus the terrestrial kind of world, and how that might have been like, well, that might be the true world and this might be the kind of imperfect reflection of that?
He doesn't, I would almost say he doesn't know enough about the Greek stuff to even make that distinction, in all honesty.
Yeah.
And
that's
even there, what's going on is super weird even in like the Greek case with all that stuff. What he does say is that when that's a possibility for you, so when you can have that sort of Ptolemaic kind of astronomy where you have this sort of like divine heavenly sphere that's a visible heavenly sphere, right? The stars themselves and their orbits. That at least suggests that actually kind of gives a certain sort of weight and eminence to human beings, he thinks. Like it makes us kind of cooler because it means the universe is this ordered cosmos, right? And we're not at the highest point, but we humans are still we're somewhere in that hierarchy. And we're not at the bottom, we're not rocks or whatever, right? Like, we matter, we're important. He thinks that once you get to the Copernican astronomy, you actually ever increasingly make human beings less and less important. We become more and more irrelevant, we have less and less a place in the world is not for us or speaks to us in ever increasingly less sense. And again, that's why the sort of modern science is rooted in a kind of nihilism, he thinks. Because the modern science is moving ever increasingly in the direction of, humans don't matter, humans are irrelevant, humans are unimportant. And that's nihilism, that's ennui, that's sickness. Right? That's not health.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. All right. So we'll say, I'm happy to say class is dismissed. I'll unmute everyone in case anyone just wants to chat a little bit longer. I'll see you should all be unmuted, at least in principle. I should have unmuted everyone. And
Thank you.
I'll see you all on Thursday, and we can chat a little bit if anyone wants to. Have a good one.
Thanks.
I've noticed that my ability to retain information is just evaporating.
I know.
like screens. I feel like people assume screens you can just like learn on screens just as easily as in person, but like what screens do, I feel like people don't really understand just like how bizarre the concept of a screen is, and the concept of like needing through these like weird portals of information.
I understand that. I'm struggling.
Yeah, geez, like
I think I'm just about the least tech savvy millennial out
Yeah.
there, and this has been a really brutal transition for me.
I think
yeah, it's not just
Go
you.
ahead.
It's not just you. I think it's all of us. So I just want to be as honest as possible. Nothing we're doing right now is ideal. Right.
Yeah.
This is my best effort to stimulate, because like when stuff's on the screen, like you were saying, it's not contextualized. Right? It's just like, here's a bunch of free-floating information. Doing it this way, my hope is that because we're doing it together, people can ask questions and stuff, it more contextualizes it, but not as much as if we were together. When we're together, we can. It's more grounded in something.
Yeah, this is like the only class I have that like is using Zoom. All my others are just like recorded, and it's not as ideal.
That's worse. That's so much worse.
So bad.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, this I much prefer. So
that's why I'm doing it this way, at least. Whether or not it is actually